In the 90s, one video game company produced the greatest games of a generation. That company was Rare. They produced hits like GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Perfect Dark, Diddy Kong Racing, Conker's Bad Fur Day, some of the most iconic games on the Nintendo 64. For years, Rare seemed untouchable. Every time they released a game, it felt like an instant classic, and Nintendo had it all. Then, Microsoft bought Rare. So was this one of the biggest mistakes Nintendo has ever made? In the late 1990s, Rare was unstoppable. While Nintendo was producing industry-defining hits like Mario and Zelda, Rare had become something just as valuable, a second powerhouse capable of creating system-selling games. GoldenEye revolutionized console shooters, Banjo-Kazooie became one of the most beloved platformers of all time, Perfect Dark pushed the Nintendo 64 to its limits, Diddy Kong Racing challenged Mario Kart, Conker's Bad Fur Day proved that the Nintendo 64 wasn't just for kids. And that's before we even mention Donkey Kong 64, one of the greatest collectathons ever produced. For many Nintendo fans, Rare wasn't just another developer. They were Nintendo's secret weapon. So when the opportunity came for Nintendo to buy Rare outright, it seemed like a no-brainer. But they didn't. Instead, Rare was sold to Microsoft for hundreds of millions of dollars, ending one of gaming's most successful partnerships. And ever since, gamers have asked the same question. Did Nintendo make one of the biggest mistakes in gaming history? Or is the story far more complicated than that? Because when you look closer, you start to realize something interesting. Nintendo may not have lost the Rare everyone remembers. Today we're looking at the rise of Rare, Nintendo's decision not to buy them, and whether this was truly the $375 million mistake that changed Nintendo forever. At first glance, it sounds like Nintendo lost Rare, but that's not really what happened. In fact, Nintendo and Rare had been closely connected for years. Back in the 1990s, Nintendo owned nearly half of the company. Rare wasn't technically a first-party Nintendo studio, but it was about as close as you could get. The partnership had already produced one of the biggest success stories of the Super Nintendo era. In 1994, Rare released Donkey Kong Country, a game that stunned players with its pre-rendered 3D graphics and helped breathe new life into an aging Super Nintendo. At a time when the industry was beginning to look towards the next generation, Donkey Kong Country reminded everyone that Nintendo still had plenty of fight left. And it wasn't just the visuals. The game's soundtrack became legendary. Its characters became icons, and its success turned Rare into one of Nintendo's most valuable partners almost overnight. And then came the Nintendo 64. While Nintendo delivered generation-defining classics like Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, Rare seemed determined to build a legacy of its own. GoldenEye revolutionized the console shooters. Banjo-Kazooie became one of the most beloved platformers ever made. Diddy Kong Racing took that challenge right to Mario Kart. Perfect Dark pushed the Nintendo 64 hardware to its limits. Donkey Kong 64 became one of the system's biggest releases, and Conker's Bad Fur Day showed a completely different side of what Nintendo 64 games could be. By the end of the decade, Rare wasn't just another studio making games for Nintendo. For many fans, Rare had become Nintendo's secret weapon. The relationship seemed unbreakable. Nintendo owned 49% of the company. Rare's biggest games appeared exclusively on Nintendo's hardware. And with hit after hit arriving on store shelves, it felt like the two companies were building that future together. Which is why what happens next came as such a shock. By the early 2000s, Rare's founders Tim and Chris Stamper were looking to sell their shares in the company. Suddenly, Nintendo had an opportunity. They already had a close relationship with Rare, they already owned 49% of the company, and many fans assumed Nintendo would simply buy the remaining shares and officially bring Rare into the family. On paper, it seemed like a no-brainer. With the PlayStation 2 dominating headlines and a new console generation underway, securing one of the industry's most successful developers looked like an obvious move. But that's not what happened. Nintendo looked at the opportunity, and they passed. Instead, another company stepped in with an offer that would change Rare's future forever. It was now the early 2000s, And for the first time in years, a new challenger was entering the console wars: Microsoft. Unlike Sega or Nintendo, Microsoft wasn't known for making games. They were known for building software, operating systems, and some of the most successful technology products in the world. But they had money. A lot of money. And they had their sights set on an industry that was growing faster than ever before: the video game market. On November 15th, 2001, Microsoft launched the Xbox. For a first attempt at a game console, it was an incredibly ambitious piece of hardware. It was more powerful than the PlayStation 2, featured a built-in hard drive, and looked unlike anything else on the market. But hardware alone doesn't sell consoles, games do. Fortunately for Microsoft, they had a game: Halo. Developed by Bungie and released alongside the Xbox, Halo wasn't just another launch title. It was a phenomenon. I still remember playing Halo for the first time, exploring the mysterious Ring world, battling the Covenant, and looking at those graphics thinking, this is it. Games can't possibly look any better than this. Of course they did, but at the time Halo felt like the future. The Xbox was off to a strong start, yet Microsoft knew one game wasn't enough. If they wanted to compete with Nintendo and Sony, they needed more than just one hit. They needed a pipeline of hits. They needed studios, not just any studio. They needed developers with a proven track record of creating system-selling games. Studios that could release a game and instantly generate excitement. Studios with names that gamers trusted. And there weren't many studios in the world that fit that description better than Rare. After all, this wasn't some unknown developer. This was the company behind GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Diddy Kong Racing, Donkey Kong 64, and so many more. 5 of the 20 best-selling Nintendo 64 games had been developed by Rare. When Rare released a game, people paid attention. And now, for the first time in years, they were available. The timing couldn't have been better for Microsoft. The Stamper Brothers wanted to sell. Nintendo had passed, and Microsoft had both the motivation and the money to make it happen. On September 24, 2002, Microsoft acquired Rare for approximately $375 million. At the time, the reaction was enormous. Many gamers couldn't believe Nintendo had allowed one of its closest partners to walk away. Even worse, they hadn't just lost Rare, they had lost Rare to a direct competitor. Suddenly, Microsoft had Halo, because they had Bungie, and now Microsoft had Rare. Just imagine some of the games they could produce with them. For many people watching at the time, it felt like Xbox was assembling an all-star team. Meanwhile, Nintendo appeared to be losing ground. The PlayStation 2 was dominating the market. The GameCube was struggling to keep up, and one of Nintendo's most important development partners had just joined the opposition. From the outside, the verdict seemed obvious. Microsoft had made a brilliant move. Nintendo had made a massive mistake. But as we'll see, the story wasn't quite that simple. At this point, everything seemed to be lining up perfectly for Microsoft. They had the most powerful console on the market. They had Bungie, and with it, Halo. And now they had Rare. For many gamers, it felt like a dream partnership. The company behind some of Nintendo 64's greatest games was finally free to unleash its creativity on more powerful hardware. The expectations couldn't have been higher, and that's exactly where the problems began. Because by the time Microsoft acquired Rare, the company was already changing. Several key staff members had left or were preparing to leave. Development was becoming more complicated, games were taking longer to make, and the industry itself was changing faster than ever before. The Rare that Microsoft purchased was still talented, but it wasn't necessarily the same company that had dominated the Nintendo 64 era. Fans would soon find that out. The first major Rare title released under Microsoft's ownership was grabbed by the Ghoulies in 2003. Interestingly, the game had originally been planned for the GameCube before the acquisition took place. This wasn't the giant blockbuster many fans had imagined. Instead of another Banjo-Kazooie or GoldenEye, players were getting a light-hearted action-adventure game set inside a haunted mansion. And the reception was mixed. Critics generally praised the visuals, the humour and charm, but many felt the gameplay lacked depth and innovation. For many studios, a respectable game would have been perfectly acceptable. But Rare wasn't most studios. Rare had spent an entire generation setting impossibly high expectations. When you've created GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie and Perfect Dark, people don't expect good games, they expect masterpieces. And Grabbed by the Ghoulies wasn't viewed as a masterpiece. It was viewed as a disappointment. The pressure only grew from there. Over the remainder of the original Xbox's lifespan, Rare released just one more major title, Conker Live and Reloaded. On paper, it seemed like the perfect move. Conker was one of Rare's most beloved characters. The original Conker's Bad Fur Day had developed a cult following on the Nintendo 64, and with modern graphics and Xbox hardware, Microsoft finally had a chance to show what Rare could do. Fans responded positively. The visuals were impressive, the humour remained intact, and for many players, it was a welcome return to one of Rare's most memorable creations. But there was one problem. Conker Live and Reloaded wasn't exactly what fans expected. They didn't hate it, but it wasn't taking things to the next level, which is what fans expected going from one console to another that's far more powerful. And while fans enjoyed revisiting Conker's world, it wasn't the kind of groundbreaking release people had expected when Microsoft spent hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring Rare. Meanwhile, the gaming landscape was changing rapidly. The era of colourful mascot platformers was beginning to fade. Grand Theft Auto 3 had changed the industry. Vice City became a phenomenon. San Andreas was on the horizon. First-person shooters were exploding in popularity. Franchises like Halo and now Call of Duty were helping redefine what mainstream gaming looked like. Suddenly, audiences weren't just looking for cartoon characters and collectathons. Many players wanted larger worlds, more mature stories, more action, more realism. The market that Rare had dominated in the late 1990s wasn't disappearing completely, but it was becoming a much smaller part of the industry. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. Because maybe Microsoft's biggest challenge wasn't integrating Rare, maybe their biggest challenge was timing. They had purchased one of the most successful studios of the Nintendo 64 era just as the industry was moving away from the kinds of games that made Rare famous in the first place. Which raises an interesting question. If Rare's strengths were rooted in the Nintendo 64 era, would Nintendo have benefited from buying them at all? Or had Nintendo already recognised something that everyone else was about to learn? The gaming industry had changed.
Carrying out a reign of terror on screen.
Oh man, this is bad.
That would put them on the nation's most wanted list in real life.
And Rare was struggling to change with it. Suddenly, it wasn't Nintendo's decision that looked uncertain, it was Microsoft's. So even if Rare wasn't quite the company it had been during the Nintendo 64 era, that doesn't mean Nintendo walked away without losing something valuable. They lost Banjo-Kazooie. They lost Perfect Dark. They lost Conker. They lost one of the most successful development partners they had ever worked with. And perhaps more importantly, they lost a studio that understood Nintendo's audience better than almost anyone else. For years, Rare had consistently delivered games that felt right at home on Nintendo hardware. Their games had personality, charm, memorable characters, and a level of creativity that helped define an entire generation of players. In many ways, the separation hurt both sides. Nintendo lost a trusted partner, and Rare lost a company that had helped elevate them to legendary status. Meanwhile, the gaming industry was changing. PlayStation 2 was dominating the markets. Xbox had successfully established itself as a serious competitor. The GameCube, despite its excellent library, wasn't selling at the level Nintendo had hoped. And before long, Nintendo's focus had already begun shifting towards what would become the Wii. So looking back, did Nintendo make a mistake? On the surface, it's difficult not to say yes. Nintendo was worth billions of dollars at the time. Acquiring the remaining stake in Rare would have been a relatively small investment compared to the size of the company. They could have secured ownership of one of gaming's most respected developers and kept a collection of beloved franchises under the Nintendo umbrella. It's easy to imagine an alternate timeline where Banjo-Kazooie, Perfect Dark and Conker continued to evolve alongside Nintendo's future consoles. But history is rarely that simple. By the time that Rare was sold, key staff members had already begun leaving. Development cycles were getting longer. The industry itself was shifting away from the types of games that made Rare famous in the first place, and perhaps most importantly, there was no guarantee that purchasing Rare would have preserved the magic that made the studio so special. Companies don't make great games, people do. and many of the people responsible for Rare's greatest successes were already moving on. Maybe Nintendo would have faced exactly the same challenges that Microsoft did. Maybe Rare's struggles were inevitable regardless of who owned them. Or maybe Nintendo's family-friendly platforms would have provided the perfect home for Rare's colourful world of characters. We'll never know. And that's why the story remains so fascinating more than 20 years later. For decades, fans have described Nintendo's decision not to buy Rare as one of the biggest mistakes in gaming history. But I don't think that Nintendo passed on the Rare that created GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie and Perfect Dark. That version of Rare was already beginning to change. The real question isn't whether Nintendo should have bought Rare. It's whether the Rare everyone wanted to save still existed. And that's what makes the sale of Rare one of gaming's greatest what-if stories.